Before Sheriff Clayton Marshall murdered Monique Ellis, he spent months carefully dismantling her defenses, using techniques straight from a predator's playbook. Today, we decode exactly how he did it, so you can recognize these tactics before it's too late. In Millfield, population 12,000, Sheriff Marshall wasn't just law enforcement. He was a pillar of the community. School board member, youth mentor, father. The man parents trusted to keep their children safe. He had this way of making you feel protected, recalls former Millfield deputy Sarah Collins. People didn't just respect him, they trusted him completely. That's what made what happened so devastating. 17-year-old Monique Ellis was a promising student with college ambitions, the daughter of a hard-working single mother, best friend to Emma Marshall, the sheriff's own daughter. No one saw the calculated psychological manipulation happening behind closed doors. No one recognized how Marshall was systematically isolating, controlling, and grooming Monique, using his authority to create the perfect victim. What makes this case so important to understand, explains forensic psychologist Dr. Elena Rivera, is that Marshall didn't just commit a crime. He executed a psychological playbook that predators in positions of power have used for generations, and he nearly got away with it. The murder of Monique Ellis wasn't a crime of passion or a momentary lapse in judgment. It was the final act in a carefully orchestrated campaign of manipulation that began years earlier, a campaign that exploited every advantage Marshall's position afforded him. By examining this case through the lens of psychological manipulation, we can identify the warning signs that were missed and understand how predators in positions of authority operate. More importantly, we can learn how to protect vulnerable individuals from similar predators who may be hiding in plain sight in our own communities. Millfield prided itself on being the kind of community where people left their doors unlocked, where neighbors watched out for each other's children, where authority figures were beyond reproach. Sheriff Marshall had served the community for 15 years, rising from deputy to sheriff with overwhelming public support. His campaign posters promised protection with integrity, a slogan that would later become tragically ironic. Clayton was everywhere in this town, explains former Mayor Robert Wilson. Little league games, school functions, church events. He positioned himself as the ultimate protector, especially of young people. This carefully cultivated public image served a darker purpose. It created the perfect cover for his predatory behavior. Psychologists call this reputation shielding, building such strong public credibility that accusations seem unbelievable. Authority figures who abuse their power often invest heavily in their public persona, explains Dr. Rivera. They create a reputation so sterling that no one would believe they're capable of harm. It's their first layer of protection. For Monique Ellis, Marshall's reputation meant that when his behavior began to shift from mentorship to something more concerning, she had no context to understand what was happening. The community had taught her to trust him implicitly. Marshall's position gave him unprecedented access to vulnerable individuals. As sheriff, he could enter schools, access personal information, and interact with minors without raising suspicion. His department ran youth programs, school resource initiatives, and community outreach, all providing legitimate reasons to be around teenagers. The most dangerous predators, notes criminal psychologist Dr. James Montgomery, are those who create systems that facilitate access to potential victims. Marshall didn't just exploit his position, he shaped it to serve his predatory needs. By the time anyone began to question Marshall's special interest in Monique, his authority was so entrenched that raising concerns seemed almost sacrilegious. Who would dare question the sheriff's integrity? The connection between Sheriff Marshall and Monique began innocently enough, through his daughter Emma. The girls had been inseparable since middle school, with Monique frequently visiting the Marshall home. Monique was like family, Emma Marshall would later testify. Dad encouraged our friendship. He said Monique was a good influence on me. Now I understand he was just creating access. For Monique, whose father had left when she was 7, Marshall's initial interest seemed like genuine mentorship. He offered career advice, helped with homework, and spoke about law enforcement opportunities, all with her mother's grateful approval. Single-parent households are often specifically targeted, explains victimologist Dr. Sarah Chen. The predator positions themselves as filling a gap, offering support the busy parent cannot provide. They exploit both the child's need for attention and the parent's gratitude. Diana Ellis worked double shifts as a nurse to support her daughter. "I was grateful someone was taking an interest in Monique's future," she later explained through tears. "I thought he was helping her. I encouraged it." What no one recognized were the classic grooming indicators already present. Marshall offering special treatment, creating opportunities for one-on-one interaction, and gradually establishing himself as an emotional confidant for Monique. The grooming process begins long before any sexual abuse, Dr. Rivera explains. It starts with boundary normalization, making increasingly intimate interactions seem normal and acceptable. By her sophomore year, Monique had begun spending time at the sheriff's department after school, ostensibly learning about law enforcement careers. Marshall created a special mentorship program that existed for no other student, giving him legitimate reasons for private meetings. Monique's academic performance, once stellar, began to decline. She withdrew from previous activities and friends. These changes, typical of grooming victims, were attributed to normal teenage development and the stress of college preparation, not to the psychological manipulation she was experiencing. By the time Monique turned 16, Marshall had systematically positioned himself as her primary mentor, confidant, and authority figure. The warning signs, had anyone known to look for them, were increasingly evident. He began offering her rides home from school when Diana was working, creating regular private interactions. He established a special mentorship program for Monique at the sheriff's department, a program that existed for no other student. He gave her a cell phone for emergencies, one her mother didn't know about. He gradually isolated her from other supportive adults and peers, making himself her primary emotional support. These are textbook grooming behaviors, explains criminal psychologist Dr. James Montgomery. But they're only obvious in hindsight if you don't know what to look for. Each step seems innocent in isolation. It's the pattern that reveals the predatory intent. What makes this case so valuable to examine is how clearly it demonstrates the calculated methodology of predators in positions of authority. By understanding exactly how Marshall manipulated both Monique and the community around her, we can better protect vulnerable young people from similar predators. Before we continue with this investigation, I want to emphasize why these stories matter beyond their true crime appeal. Understanding predatory patterns saves lives. If you find this analysis valuable, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to True Crime Story Files. Your support helps us continue creating content that goes beyond sensationalism to provide genuinely educational insights into criminal psychology and prevention. In the next segment, we'll examine how Sheriff Marshall escalated his control over Monique, the psychological tactics he used to ensure her silence, and the events that ultimately led to her tragic murder when she threatened to expose him. The story of Monique Ellis isn't just a tragedy. It's a crucial lesson in recognizing the warning signs of predatory behavior before it's too late. Millfield sits nestled in a valley surrounded by rolling hills and dense forests, a picturesque town that seems frozen in time. Founded in the late 1800s as a lumber community, it evolved into a close-knit municipality where generations of families lived within blocks of one another. Millfield is the kind of place where your barber knew your grandfather and your teacher remembers when your mother was in her class, explains longtime resident Margaret Wilson. That connectedness creates a strong sense of community, but it also means everyone thinks they know everything about everyone else. This assumption that neighbors truly knew each other created a dangerous blind spot. The familiarity bred a complacency that made it difficult to imagine hidden threats. The town's economy centered around a paper mill, a regional hospital, and several small businesses that lined Main Street. With a median income below the state average, many residents worked multiple jobs to make ends meet. Diana Ellis, Monique's mother, was one of them. Millfield's social structure was traditional and hierarchical. The mayor, school principal, business owners, and law enforcement formed the town's unofficial leadership. Among them, Sheriff Clayton Marshall stood out as particularly influential. In small towns like Millfield, the sheriff isn't just another official, explains rural sociologist Dr. Thomas Brennan. They represent both protection and authority in a very personal way. They're seen as the community's guardian, a role that carries tremendous power and very little oversight. This lack of oversight proved critical in the Marshall case. The county had no effective system for monitoring the sheriff's department. The town council reviewed budgets but not operations. State oversight was minimal and typically occurred only when requested by local authorities, meaning Marshall himself would need to invite scrutiny. It was the perfect environment for abuse of power, notes Dr. Brennan. A respected authority figure, minimal supervision, and a community predisposed to trust rather than question those in charge. Clayton Marshall moved to Millfield in his late 20s, already an experienced deputy from a neighboring county. His arrival coincided with a series of property crimes that had unsettled the normally peaceful community. Within 6 months, Marshall had helped solve the case, earning immediate respect from residents and his colleagues. He presented himself as the consummate professional, recalls former Deputy James Rodriguez. Always in a perfectly pressed uniform, always prepared, always projecting confidence. He made people feel safe just by walking into a room. Marshall's rise through the ranks was swift. He became sergeant within 3 years, chief deputy 2 years later, and was elected sheriff when his predecessor retired. He ran unopposed in his first election and won by landslides in subsequent campaigns. His public image was carefully cultivated. Marshall volunteered with youth sports, attended church regularly, and served on multiple community boards. His wife Susan, a kindergarten teacher, enhanced his family man image. Their daughter Emma was a high-achieving student who seemed to embody the values Marshall claimed to uphold. Looking back, it's clear how strategic his community involvement was, explains behavioral analyst Dr. Lisa Montgomery. He didn't just participate. He specifically chose activities that positioned him as a protector and mentor of young people while building a network of influential supporters. Marshall's annual Youth Police Academy became his signature program. The 2-week summer camp introduced teenagers to law enforcement careers through hands-on activities. It was widely praised for building positive relationships between police and young people, and it gave Marshall legitimate access to dozens of teenagers each year. He created a system that not only allowed him to identify vulnerable targets, but also established him as a trusted mentor in the eyes of the community, Dr. Montgomery continues. Parents were grateful their children had such a positive role model, never suspecting his true motives. By the time he met Monique Ellis, Marshall had spent nearly a decade building an unassailable reputation in Millfield, a reputation that would later serve as his strongest defense. Monique Ellis was born to Diana and Robert Ellis on March 12th, a bright child with an infectious laugh. Former teachers describe her as intellectually curious and creative. By elementary school, she was reading above grade level and showing particular aptitude in science and writing. She was the kind of student who made teaching rewarding, remembers her 5th grade teacher, Miss Hernandez. Always asking questions, always wanting to understand the why behind things. When Monique was 7, her father abandoned the family, leaving Diana to raise their daughter alone. The single mother worked as a nurse at Millfield Regional Hospital, often taking double shifts and weekend work to provide for Monique. Diana was determined that Monique would have opportunities, explains family friend Teresa Lopez. She worked herself to exhaustion to keep their house, to pay for Monique's school activities, to save for college. She was an incredible mother under impossible circumstances. Despite the financial struggles and her father's absence, Monique thrived through middle school. She maintained high grades, participated in science club and creative writing programs, and developed close friendships, most significantly with Emma Marshall, whom she met in 7th grade biology class. They were inseparable, recalls middle school counselor David Chen. Different personalities that complemented each other perfectly. Emma was more reserved, Monique more outgoing. They balanced each other. The friendship with Emma brought Monique into the Marshall family orbit during a vulnerable period in her development. As she entered adolescence without a father figure, Sheriff Marshall's interest in her academic progress and future seemed like a blessing. Monique was particularly vulnerable to grooming, explains psychologist Dr. Rivera. She had a specific gap in her life, the absent father, that Marshall could exploit. She was also at an age where adult validation becomes increasingly important. Add to that her mother's necessary absences due to work, and you have the perfect conditions for a predator to establish themselves as a surrogate parental figure. By high school, Monique's relationship with the Marshall family had become a central part of her life, and the foundation for the tragedy that would follow. Behind the facade of the perfect family, the Marshalls' home life was far more complex than it appeared to the Millfield community. Clayton Marshall maintained strict control over his household, making most decisions unilaterally and expecting immediate compliance from his wife and daughter. Susan Marshall was like two different people, recalls neighbor Patricia Johnson. In public, she was this confident kindergarten teacher everyone adored. But around Clayton, she became almost invisible, deferring to him, checking his reactions before speaking, always seeming slightly on edge. Former colleagues at Millfield Elementary School noted Susan often declined social invitations, explaining that Clayton preferred family dinners at home. She rarely participated in faculty events that occurred in the evenings, and was known to abruptly leave gatherings when her husband called. Looking back, the control dynamics were obvious, says Dr. Montgomery. But at the time, people interpreted it as traditional marriage values or dismissed it as Susan being naturally reserved. No one recognized it as the same controlling behavior Marshall would later use against Monique. Emma Marshall navigated her father's controlling nature by becoming the perfect daughter. Excellent grades, appropriate friends, conventional activities. Former classmates describe her as unfailingly polite, but guarded, never sharing personal details about her home life. Emma learned early to present the image her father demanded, explains child psychologist Dr. Amina Patel. Children in controlling households develop an acute awareness of what will trigger disapproval or anger. They become experts at maintaining the family facade. This environment made Emma an unwitting accomplice in her father's grooming of Monique. When Monique began spending more time with Sheriff Marshall, Emma interpreted it through the lens of her own experience. Her father taking control was normal. His intense interest in their activities was expected. His insertion into their friendship was just how her family operated. Emma had no framework to recognize her father's behavior as inappropriate, Dr. Patel continues. The abnormal had been normalized for her entire life. This is how generational patterns of control and abuse perpetuate. What's dysfunctional becomes invisible because it's familiar. The first documented interaction between Sheriff Marshall and Monique Ellis outside of casual family gatherings occurred during the fall of Monique's freshman year. Emma had invited Monique to study at the Marshall home, a routine occurrence that had previously raised no concerns. That evening was different, Emma later testified. Dad came home early and spent the entire time in the dining room with us. He asked Monique about her classes, her interests, her plans for the future. Looking back, it was like an interview. This initial focused attention appeared benign, even positive. A respected adult taking interest in a teenager's academic progress and aspirations seemed commendable, especially given Monique's lack of a father figure. The first stage of grooming often looks exactly like mentorship, explains Dr. Rivera. The predator establishes themselves as helpful, interested, and safe. They identify the victim's needs and position themselves as uniquely qualified to meet those needs. In Monique's case, Marshall quickly identified several exploitable needs: guidance about her future, a father figure, and financial constraints that limited her opportunities. Within weeks of that first focused interaction, Marshall began suggesting programs, activities, and resources that he specifically could provide. I remember him telling Monique about college scholarships for children of law enforcement, Emma recalled. When she mentioned her dad wasn't around, he said, "That's why mentorship programs exist, to fill those gaps." By Christmas of that freshman year, Marshall had created a seemingly legitimate reason to increase his contact with Monique. He established an Explorer program at the Sheriff's Department, ostensibly for high school students interested in law enforcement careers. While technically open to all students, Marshall personally recruited Monique, arranged her transportation, and scheduled her sessions when the department was least busy. He created a structure that normalized one-on-one time, notes criminal behaviorist Dr. Wilson. This is a critical step in grooming, establishing legitimate-seeming contexts for increasing private contact. To outsiders, it looked like a dedicated public servant mentoring a promising student. In reality, it was a predator creating access to his target. By the spring semester of Monique's freshman year, subtle shifts in her behavior began to emerge. These changes, while noticeable to those closest to her, were easily attributed to normal adolescent development rather than recognized as warning signs. Diana Ellis first noticed her daughter's increasing secretiveness about her schedule. She became vague about her after-school activities, Diana later explained. When I asked specific questions, she'd give minimal answers or change the subject. I assumed it was just teenage privacy, not that she was being coached to withhold information. Monique's teachers observed changes in her academic performance and classroom engagement. Her previously consistent A grades began to fluctuate, with exceptional work in some assignments contrasting with incomplete submissions for others. Her attention seemed divided, reported her English teacher, Miss Rodriguez. She'd participate brilliantly one day, then appear completely disengaged the next. When I asked if everything was okay, she'd insist she was fine, just tired from all her activities. Friends noticed Monique becoming less available for social events, particularly on weekends. She began declining invitations, citing vague family obligations or special projects that consumed her time. Her once active social media presence became sporadic and carefully curated. The changes were incremental, explains psychologist Dr. Chen. This is intentional on the predator's part. Sudden, dramatic changes raise alarms, but gradual shifts are easily rationalized. It's the boiling frog phenomenon. The temperature rises so slowly that the danger isn't perceived until it's too late. Perhaps most telling was Monique's changing relationship with Emma Marshall. While they remained close friends, Emma later recalled Monique becoming uncomfortable at the Marshall home, preferring to meet elsewhere. When at Emma's house, Monique would grow tense when Sheriff Marshall returned from work. She would check the time constantly when we were at my house, Emma testified. If Dad came home early, she'd make excuses to leave. I thought maybe they'd had some disagreement about her participation in the Explorer program. I never imagined what was really happening. These behavioral changes, secretiveness, academic inconsistency, social withdrawal, and anxiety around Marshall, represented classic responses to the early stages of grooming and manipulation. Several concerning incidents occurred during Monique's sophomore year that, in retrospect, should have triggered intervention. However, each red flag was rationalized, dismissed, or misinterpreted by adults who had no reason to suspect the respected sheriff of predatory behavior. The first documented concern came from Monique's school counselor, Mr. Patel, who noticed Marshall frequently picking Monique up from school, an unusual arrangement given that Emma typically took the bus home. When Mr. Patel casually inquired about this, Marshall explained he was mentoring Monique for a special law enforcement scholarship program. "I actually thought it was commendable," Mr. Patel later admitted. A busy public official making time to help a promising student. The school even highlighted their mentorship in the district newsletter as an example of community partnership. A more serious incident occurred when Diana Ellis unexpectedly returned home early from a shift and found Marshall's unmarked police vehicle in her driveway. Inside, Marshall and Monique were reviewing what he claimed were college application materials. Diana noted that Monique seemed startled and uncomfortable by her arrival. "Something felt off about the situation," Diana later recalled. "But when I questioned it, Clayton explained he was helping Monique prepare for a summer program that could lead to scholarship opportunities. He was so professional, so convincing. I ended up thanking him for his interest in my daughter's future." Perhaps the most significant missed warning sign came from Deputy Sarah Collins, who observed Marshall and Monique in what appeared to be an intense, private conversation in his office after hours. When Collins entered the room, Marshall abruptly changed his tone and topic. "His body language shifted completely when I walked in," Collins stated. "He moved away from Monique and suddenly started talking about a community outreach program. Something about it bothered me, but questioning the sheriff about his mentorship program seemed out of line." Collins mentioned her discomfort to another senior deputy, who dismissed her concerns. "That's just Clayton being Clayton. He takes these mentorship roles seriously. Remember how he helped the Rodriguez kid last year? Same thing." Each of these red flags was observed in isolation, without the context that would have revealed their true significance. What makes the Marshall case so instructive, explains forensic psychologist Dr. Rivera, is how perfectly it illustrates the textbook stages of grooming by an authority figure. Each phase was executed with precision, leveraging his position to normalize what should have been concerning behaviors. Experts identify several distinct stages in Marshall's grooming process during this early period. First came the selection phase, where Marshall identified Monique as an ideal target due to specific vulnerabilities: absent father, busy single mother, financial constraints, and connection to his daughter that provided initial access. Predators are remarkably adept at identifying vulnerability, notes victimologist Dr. Sarah Chen. Marshall recognized that Monique's circumstances created both a need he could exploit and reduced protective oversight. Her connection to Emma gave him a legitimate reason for initial contact. The second phase involved gaining trust and establishing himself as a unique benefactor. Marshall created special opportunities available only through him: the Explorer program, scholarship information, and career mentorship that positioned him as essential to Monique's future success. This exclusivity is crucial, Dr. Chen continues. The predator creates a situation where the victim believes their goals, dreams, or needs can only be met through this relationship. It creates dependency while appearing benevolent. The third phase focused on isolation and information control. Marshall began inserting himself between Monique and other support systems, positioning himself as her primary advisor and gradually controlling what information was shared with others, including her mother. The isolation doesn't happen all at once, explains criminal behaviorist Dr. Wilson. It's incremental, scheduling mentorship during times she would normally spend with friends, creating special projects that require secrecy, gradually limiting her other relationships while strengthening her dependence on him. The fourth phase involved boundary testing and desensitization. Marshall began with small boundary violations, private conversations about personal matters, rides home without Emma present, texts outside of normal hours, gradually normalizing increasingly inappropriate interactions. Each boundary crossed makes the next violation seem less significant, Dr. Wilson notes. What begins as slightly uncomfortable becomes the new normal. By the time serious violations occur, the victim's sense of appropriate boundaries has been systematically dismantled. These early warning signs, while clear to experts in retrospect, remained invisible to a community that had no reason to suspect their trusted sheriff of predatory intent. As Monique entered her junior year, Marshall's grooming tactics intensified and became more sophisticated. What had begun as seemingly innocent mentorship evolved into a calculated campaign of psychological manipulation. The transition from mentorship to exploitation typically accelerates once the groundwork is laid, explains Dr. Rivera. The predator has established trust, tested boundaries, and assessed the victim's vulnerabilities. Now they begin to leverage that foundation for greater control. Marshall's first significant escalation came in the form of a secret cell phone, a prepaid device he gave Monique for emergencies and program communications. This phone, unknown to Diana Ellis, created a private communication channel Marshall could use without oversight. The secret phone is a critical ability for predators, notes digital forensics expert Dr. Marcus Chen. It establishes a direct line of control and communication that bypasses parental supervision. It also introduces the element of secrecy, teaching the victim to hide things from protective figures in their life. Text messages recovered during the investigation revealed Marshall's strategic use of this private channel. His communications followed a pattern experts call intermittent reinforcement, alternating between lavish praise and subtle criticism, creating an emotional dependency where Monique constantly sought his approval. He would build her up with messages like, "You're the most promising student I've ever mentored," or "You have a future in law enforcement that others can only dream of," explains psychologist Dr. Montgomery. Then he would follow with subtle undermining. "I'm concerned about your commitment level," or "Other mentors wouldn't invest this much time in someone who isn't fully dedicated." This emotional manipulation was coupled with increasing demands on Monique's time and attention. Marshall created a special advanced track in his Explorer program that required additional hours, always under his direct supervision. He scheduled these sessions during times that conflicted with her other activities and friendships. The time demands serve multiple purposes, Dr. Montgomery continues. They physically isolate the victim from peer relationships, they create exhaustion that makes resistance more difficult, and they establish the predator's priorities as paramount. The message is clear: nothing is more important than this relationship. By mid-junior year, Marshall had successfully positioned himself as the central figure in Monique's life, her mentor, confidant, and the perceived gateway to her future success. This foundation allowed him to begin more direct exploitation while maintaining psychological control. Marshall employed sophisticated isolation tactics that systematically separated Monique from her support network while making this separation appear voluntary and beneficial. Isolation is never presented as isolation, explains Dr. Wilson. It's framed as specialization, focus, or dedication to goals. The victim is made to believe they're not losing connections, they're prioritizing what really matters. The first relationships Marshall targeted were Monique's friendships outside his daughter Emma. Text messages recovered from the secret phone show him subtly criticizing these friends. "I'm concerned about Sarah's influence on your focus." And "College admissions officers look at who you associate with. Does Jason really align with your goals?" Simultaneously, Marshall created scheduling conflicts that made maintaining these friendships difficult. The Advanced Explorer program sessions were deliberately scheduled during social events, forcing Monique to choose between her future opportunities and her social life. He created false choices, notes Dr. Chen. Monique wasn't actually choosing between friends and opportunities. She was choosing between friends and Marshall's manipulation, but he framed it as dedication to her future. Marshall also began driving wedges between Monique and other adult mentors. When her English teacher expressed interest in helping Monique apply for a writing scholarship, Marshall discouraged it, telling Monique, "Those literary scholarships are extremely competitive. Our law enforcement pathway offers much better odds for someone with your background." Perhaps most concerning was Marshall's systematic effort to limit communication between Monique and her mother. He encouraged Monique to downplay her involvement in his programs, suggesting Diana might not understand the professional nature of our work or might limit your participation out of misplaced concern. This separation from parental oversight is particularly dangerous, explains family therapist Dr. Amina Patel. Marshall was effectively teaching Monique to hide information from her primary protector while positioning himself as the more understanding adult figure. The isolation extended to Monique's relationship with Emma Marshall as well. While maintaining the appearance of supporting their friendship, Sheriff Marshall began scheduling Monique's special training during times Emma was at other activities. When the girls were together, he would frequently interrupt with calls or texts to Monique on the secret phone. He was essentially training Monique to prioritize his demands over all other relationships, Dr. Patel continues. The message was consistent. Everyone else in your life is secondary to me and what I can offer you. By the beginning of senior year, Monique's social circle had contracted dramatically. Her primary relationships were now limited to Marshall, Emma, and her increasingly concerned but uninformed mother. Marshall's most insidious manipulation involved creating deep psychological and emotional dependency, making Monique believe her entire future hinged on his continued support and approval. This form of emotional control is particularly effective with ambitious teenagers, explains Dr. Montgomery. Marshall positioned himself as the gatekeeper to Monique's dreams, the one person who could make or break her future. The dependency began with Marshall taking control of Monique's college planning process. He discouraged her from working with school counselors, claiming they don't understand the specialized pathways into law enforcement. Instead, he personally selected which schools she should apply to, all institutions where he claimed to have connections that could give her an advantage. He was literally planning her geographic future, notes Dr. Rivera. Each school he recommended was within his sphere of influence, but far enough from Millfield to separate her from her mother and local support system. Marshall reinforced this dependency through a technique psychologists call manufactured crises and rescues. He would create or exaggerate problems, generate anxiety in Monique, then position himself as the only one who could resolve the situation. In one documented instance, Marshall told Monique that her participation in a standard school activity might raise red flags with law enforcement academy reviewers. After letting her panic for several days, he made some calls and fixed the situation, demonstrating his indispensable power in her life. This crisis rescue cycle creates a powerful emotional bond, explains Dr. Montgomery. The victim experiences intense relief and gratitude toward their rescuer, never recognizing that the crisis was manufactured specifically to create that dependency. Perhaps most disturbing was Marshall's manipulation of Monique's self-perception and confidence. Text messages reveal a pattern of subtle undermining followed by conditional support. "I'm concerned about your presentation skills. They're not at the level needed for this career path, but I'm willing to work with you personally to improve them." This pattern extended to her appearance, academic performance, and even her personality. Marshall offered frequent, constructive criticism about aspects of Monique that might hold her back professionally, then positioned himself as uniquely willing to help her overcome these supposed deficiencies. He was systematically dismantling her self-confidence while making her dependent on his approval, Dr. Rivera explains. By senior year, Monique's sense of self-worth was deeply entangled with Marshall's validation. She believed she needed him, not just for opportunities, but for her very identity and value. This emotional dependency created the conditions where exploitation could occur with minimal resistance, as Monique had been conditioned to trust Marshall's judgment over her own instincts and concerns. Marshall's position as sheriff provided unique advantages in his predatory behavior, advantages he systematically exploited to facilitate access, ensure silence, and prevent detection. Authority figures who abuse their power have built-in abilities that other predators lack, explains criminal justice professor Dr. James Wilson. Marshall didn't just have personal authority over Monique. He had institutional authority over the entire community, including those who might otherwise have protected her. Marshall leveraged his position to create legitimate-seeming access to Monique in ways that would have raised concerns coming from any other adult. He could remove her from school for educational opportunities, transport her in official vehicles, and meet with her privately in official settings without raising suspicion. His badge literally opened doors, notes Dr. Wilson. School administrators, who would question any other adult picking up a student, deferred to the sheriff. His uniform and vehicle provided automatic credibility for his presence anywhere in the community. Beyond physical access, Marshall's position gave him information advantages. As sheriff, he had access to school records, counseling reports, and even medical information, all under the guise of his youth mentorship programs. This allowed him to monitor Monique's communications with other adults and intercept potential disclosures. He essentially had surveillance capabilities, explains Dr. Chen. If Monique spoke to a counselor about feeling uncomfortable, Marshall would know. If her mother called the school with concerns, he would be informed. His position created an information monopoly that served his predatory goals. Perhaps most significantly, Marshall's authority created a powerful silencing mechanism. As the highest law enforcement official in the county, he represented the very system designed to protect against the type of abuse he was perpetrating. Who do you report the sheriff to? Asks victim advocate Sarah Johnson. In Monique's mind, and in reality, Marshall was the authority. Reporting him meant challenging the entire power structure of her community, a nearly impossible task for a teenager already under psychological manipulation. Before we continue to the most disturbing aspects of this case, I want to ask you to share your insights in the comments. Have you noticed similar warning signs in cases from your community? What institutional protections might have prevented this abuse of power? Your experiences and observations help build collective awareness that can protect vulnerable individuals. If you're finding this analysis valuable, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support allows us to continue creating content that examines these cases from a prevention-focused perspective rather than mere sensationalism. By the time Monique entered her senior year, Marshall had established nearly complete control over her life, setting the stage for the sexual exploitation that would ultimately lead to pregnancy, confrontation, and murder. To understand how a respected sheriff transformed into a murderer requires examining the psychological patterns that drive predatory behavior in authority figures. What makes the Marshall case particularly valuable from a psychological perspective is that it wasn't impulsive, explains forensic psychologist Dr. Rivera. Each action, from selection to grooming to murder, followed established patterns of predatory behavior. Understanding these patterns helps us identify similar predators before they escalate to violence. Psychological assessments conducted after Marshall's arrest revealed several key characteristics common to authority figures who abuse their positions. First was an entitlement mentality, a deep-seated belief that his position granted him special privileges and exemptions from normal social and legal boundaries. This entitlement wasn't just about breaking rules, but about believing the rules fundamentally didn't apply to him. In Marshall's prison interviews, he repeatedly used phrases like, "No one understands the pressures of my position," and "I dedicated my life to this community," notes criminal psychologist Dr. Montgomery. He viewed his public service not as a responsibility but as a transaction, one that entitled him to take what he wanted in return. Second was compartmentalization, the ability to separate his public persona from his private actions without experiencing significant cognitive dissonance. Marshall could shift seamlessly between being the respected sheriff in public settings and a manipulative predator in private interactions with Monique. This compartmentalization isn't the same as the double life we often see in serial offenders, Dr. Montgomery explains. Marshall didn't see himself as having two separate identities. Rather, he viewed his public and private behaviors as different expressions of his singular entitled identity. Third was strategic thinking and risk assessment. Unlike impulsive offenders, Marshall carefully calculated each step, weighing potential benefits against risks of exposure. This wasn't a man who lost control. It was someone who believed he could control every variable, including Monique herself. The extensive grooming period, the careful isolation, the creation of the Explorer program as cover, these weren't spontaneous decisions, notes behavioral analyst Dr. Wilson. Marshall was methodically creating an environment where his abuse could occur with minimal risk of detection. When that environment was threatened by Monique's pregnancy, he made the calculated decision that murder carried less personal risk than exposure. The relationship between Marshall and Monique exemplifies how extreme power imbalances create the conditions for exploitation and abuse. Multiple layers of authority, institutional, social, and psychological, combine to give Marshall nearly absolute control. When we analyze the power dynamics in this case, we see at least 5 distinct advantages Marshall held, explains Dr. Chen. Each alone would create significant influence. Together, they formed an almost inescapable web of control. The first and most obvious was institutional authority. As sheriff, Marshall represented the legal system itself. His badge, uniform, and position gave him structural power that few in the community would challenge. Institutional authority creates a presumption of righteousness, notes sociologist Dr. Thomas Brennan. People are conditioned to believe that those in such positions have been vetted, are trustworthy, and act in the community's best interest. This presumption creates a powerful shield against suspicion or accusation. The second layer was age and experience. The 4-decade age gap between Marshall and Monique created an inherent power imbalance. His life experience, compared to her adolescent perspective, gave his opinions and directions seeming validity and weight. Third was informational control. Marshall restricted what information Monique received about law enforcement careers, college opportunities, and even appropriate relationships. By controlling her access to information, he shaped her understanding of reality itself. Information asymmetry is a powerful control mechanism, Dr. Brennan explains. When one person controls what information another receives, they essentially control how that person perceives the world. Marshall created a reality where his guidance wasn't just helpful, it was essential. Fourth was social capital. Marshall's standing in the community meant that challenging him would come at enormous social cost. Monique understood correctly that accusing the beloved sheriff would likely result in her being disbelieved and ostracized. Finally, and perhaps most insidiously, was psychological control developed through years of manipulation. By the time the abuse became sexual, Marshall had already conditioned Monique to prioritize his approval, doubt her own perceptions, and keep secrets. The psychological bonds created through long-term grooming can be stronger than physical restraints, notes Dr. Montgomery. Marshall didn't need to threaten Monique explicitly. He had spent years building psychological constraints that were far more effective than any lock or key. At the core of Marshall's predatory behavior was a sophisticated exploitation of trust, not just Monique's trust in him, but the community's trust in his position and character. Trust exploitation operates on multiple levels in authority-based abuse, explains Dr. Rivera. The predator simultaneously exploits the victim's personal trust, the parent's trust, and the community's institutional trust in their position. Marshall first cultivated Monique's personal trust through what experts call targeted benevolence, identifying specific needs and meeting them in ways that created emotional debt and dependency. He offered guidance when she felt directionless, validation when she felt insecure, and opportunities when she worried about her future. This isn't random kindness, notes victim advocate Sarah Johnson. It's strategic investment. Marshall identified exactly what Monique needed most: career guidance, father figure approval, financial pathways to college, and positioned himself as the exclusive provider of those needs. Simultaneously, Marshall cultivated Diana Ellis's trust through a different form of manipulation. To Monique's mother, he presented himself as a concerned public servant investing in youth development. He emphasized the professional nature of his mentorship and the opportunities it would create for Monique. He effectively borrowed credibility from his position, Johnson continues. Diana wasn't just trusting Clayton Marshall, the man. She was trusting Sheriff Marshall, the institution. This institutional trust is much harder to question or withdraw, even when concerns arise. The community's trust provided the third and perhaps most powerful layer of protection. Marshall had spent years building his reputation through visible community service, public speaking about youth safety, and presenting himself as a family man with traditional values. Community trust creates a protective barrier around authority figures, explains Dr. Brennan. When someone is universally respected, people automatically discount negative information about them. They rationalize concerning behaviors or dismiss them entirely. This collective investment in the person's good character becomes a form of community-wide cognitive dissonance. This multi-layered trust exploitation created a perfect environment for abuse. Monique trusted Marshall's guidance, her mother trusted his professional intentions, and the community trusted his character so completely that questioning it seemed almost sacrilegious. Trust is meant to be a social good, Dr. Rivera notes. What makes predators like Marshall particularly dangerous is their ability to weaponize this social good, turning our natural inclination to trust authority into a mechanism for exploitation. The Marshall case, while shocking, follows patterns seen in other high-profile cases of authority figure abuse. Examining these commonalities reveals systemic vulnerabilities that enable predators in positions of power. When we compare the Marshall case to other instances of authority-based abuse, whether in religious institutions, educational settings, sports organizations, or law enforcement, we see striking similarities in both predatory tactics and institutional failures, explains Dr. Wilson. The case shares key elements with the Jerry Sandusky scandal at Penn State, where a respected coach used a youth program to access victims while the institution failed to act on warning signs. Like Marshall, Sandusky created a legitimate youth organization that provided both access to potential victims and a shield of respectability. Youth programs created by authority figures deserve particular scrutiny, notes child protection specialist Dr. James Wilson. These programs often lack the oversight and safeguards of established organizations while granting significant private access to minors. The Marshall case also parallels patterns seen in cases of police officer misconduct involving vulnerable individuals. Studies of such cases reveal how the power to detain, question, and operate with minimal supervision creates opportunities for exploitation. Law enforcement positions create unique opportunities for abuse, explains criminal justice researcher Dr. Maria Rodriguez. Officers can initiate contact with potential victims through legitimate police functions, can isolate individuals without raising suspicion, and often face a blue wall of silence that discourages reporting of concerning behaviors. Religious authority abuse cases share another common element with the Marshall case: the exploitation of moral authority. Just as religious leaders can frame their actions as divinely sanctioned, Marshall used his position as the community's moral authority to define what was right or appropriate in his relationship with Monique. When someone represents moral authority in a community, they gain the power to define morality itself, notes Dr. Brennan. Marshall could frame his inappropriate interest in Monique as mentorship because he had the authority to define what mentorship should look like. Perhaps most importantly, these cases share a common institutional failure: the prioritization of reputation over protection. In each instance, warning signs were dismissed or minimized to preserve the institution's or individual's standing in the community. The pattern is clear across contexts, Dr. Rodriguez concludes. When we value institutional reputation more than individual safety, we create environments where predators can operate with impunity. The Marshall case isn't an anomaly, it's the predictable result of prioritizing authority over accountability. The discovery of Monique's pregnancy in early March of her senior year marked the critical turning point in the case, the moment when Marshall's carefully constructed facade began to crumble. According to court testimony, Monique first suspected she might be pregnant after missing her period in February. Initially, she dismissed her symptoms as stress-related, given the pressure of college applications and her increasingly complicated relationship with Marshall. Denial is common in these situations, explains Dr. Montgomery, particularly for victims of grooming and manipulation. Acknowledging the pregnancy would mean confronting the reality of the abuse, something Monique had been psychologically conditioned to minimize or rationalize. By early March, however, the physical symptoms became impossible to ignore. Text messages recovered from the secret phone show Monique finally confiding in Marshall on March 7th. "I think I'm pregnant. I'm scared. What do we do?" Marshall's initial response appeared supportive but controlling. "Don't panic. Don't tell anyone. I'll get a test. We'll figure this out together." He arranged to meet her that afternoon in the parking lot of a pharmacy one town over, where he purchased a pregnancy test and instructed her to use it in the store bathroom. When the test confirmed her pregnancy, surveillance footage from the pharmacy parking lot shows Marshall and Monique in an intense conversation in his unmarked police vehicle. Though no audio exists, body language experts who reviewed the footage noted Marshall's aggressive gesturing and Monique's defensive posture. That parking lot conversation was likely the first moment Monique saw Marshall's mask truly slip, notes Dr. Rivera. Until then, his manipulation had been calculated and controlled. The pregnancy represented a threat to everything he had built: his career, reputation, freedom, and his response would have revealed the true nature of his interest in her. Phone records show that immediately following this meeting, Marshall made a series of calls to a burner phone purchased 3 months earlier. Investigators later determined these calls were to a former deputy with a history of providing unofficial favors for Marshall. The timeline suggests Marshall began contingency planning immediately, explains lead investigator Detective Sarah Johnson. Within hours of confirming the pregnancy, he was already exploring options to contain what he perceived as an existential threat. In the 2 weeks following the pregnancy confirmation, Marshall's behavior shifted dramatically from calculated manipulation to increasingly desperate control measures. This period, documented through text messages, witness statements, and Marshall's own actions, reveals how quickly his predatory composure deteriorated when faced with potential exposure. Marshall's reaction followed a pattern we often see when long-term predators face discovery, explains Dr. Wilson. There's an initial period of reassurance and problem-solving, followed by escalating control tactics as they realize the situation may be beyond their manipulation. The text messages from March 8 to 10 show Marshall presenting himself as a calm problem solver, telling Monique, "I have connections at a private clinic in neighboring state. No records, complete confidentiality. I'll take care of everything." He emphasized their special relationship and promised that terminating the pregnancy would allow them to continue building your future together. When Monique expressed reluctance about abortion in texts on March 11th, Marshall's tone shifted noticeably. Messages became longer, more frequent, and increasingly focused on the consequences of the pregnancy becoming known. Your mother would never understand. Your college opportunities would disappear. People would blame you, not me. I'd lose my job, but you'd lose your entire future. By March 15th, Marshall began monitoring Monique's movements more intensively. He adjusted patrol schedules to drive by her home and school multiple times daily, used department resources to track her mother's work schedule, and insisted Monique keep the secret phone on at all times. This surveillance served two purposes, notes Detective Johnson. It was partly to ensure Monique wasn't disclosing the pregnancy to others, but it was also a form of intimidation, a reminder that he was watching her constantly. Perhaps most revealing was Marshall's abrupt withdrawal of support for Monique's college applications. After months of promising to use his connections to help her gain admission to criminal justice programs, he suddenly suggested she might want to consider community college locally. Or take a gap year to figure things out. This was a clear threat, explains Dr. Montgomery. He was demonstrating his power to withdraw the future he had promised her. The message was unmistakable. Without his support, everything they had built together would disappear. It was emotional blackmail designed to force her compliance with his demands. As March progressed, Marshall's tactics escalated from manipulation to overt control and veiled threats. His behavior during this period demonstrates the dangerous progression that can occur when a predator feels their power slipping away. The third week of March represents a critical escalation phase, explains Dr. Rivera. Marshall was no longer just manipulating Monique. He was actively working to contain what he perceived as an imminent threat to his freedom and reputation. Marshall's first containment strategy involved physically isolating Monique from potential support systems. He abruptly suspended all group activities in the Explorer program, claiming budget constraints required a temporary restructuring. This eliminated Monique's contact with other students and deputies who might notice her condition or emotional state. Simultaneously, he created reasons to separate Monique from Emma Marshall. Text messages to his daughter during this period show him encouraging Emma to focus on her own college preparations and suggesting she give Monique space to deal with some personal issues. When Emma expressed concern about her friend, Marshall assured her he was keeping an eye on the situation. He was systematically cutting off all avenues for disclosure, notes victim advocate Sarah Johnson. Anyone who might notice Monique's pregnancy or emotional distress was being strategically distanced from her. By late March, Marshall's communications with Monique took on increasingly threatening undertones. While never explicitly threatening violence, he began emphasizing his power and her vulnerability in ways that conveyed clear warnings. In one particularly disturbing text from March 23rd, Marshall wrote, "Remember that case I told you about? The student who made false accusations against her teacher? She ended up with a record that followed her forever. No college would touch her. Such a waste of potential." During their final documented meeting on March 25th at the Sheriff's Department, Marshall showed Monique a folder he claimed contained contingency plans. According to Monique's later statement to investigators, he told her, "I've been sheriff for 15 years. I know things about this town and its people that would shock you. I've protected this community, and I know how to protect myself." These weren't just threats, explains Dr. Wilson. They were demonstrations of power designed to convince Monique that resistance was futile, that Marshall could destroy her life with impunity if she didn't comply with his demands. Despite Marshall's escalating control tactics, evidence shows Monique made several attempts to reach out for help in the weeks before her murder. Attempts that were either missed, misinterpreted, or actively intercepted by Marshall. What makes this case particularly tragic is that Monique was trying to break free, explained Sarah Johnson. She was taking small but significant steps toward disclosure, but the very systems that should have protected her were compromised by Marshall's position. Monique's first documented attempt at reaching out occurred on March 18th when she visited the school counselor, Mr. Patel. School records show she requested information about pregnancy resources for a friend. Mr. Patel provided general information, but following school protocol notified the school resource officer about the inquiry, an officer who reported directly to Marshall. Within hours of that meeting, Marshall texted Monique, "We need to talk about your visit with the counselor," notes Detective Johnson. The system designed to help her essentially reported her disclosure attempt directly to her abuser. On March 21st, phone records show Monique attempted to call a crisis hotline from her personal phone, but disconnected after less than 30 seconds. That evening, Marshall unexpectedly visited the Ellis home, claiming he was checking in on Monique's college applications. Perhaps most significant was Monique's attempt to confide in Emma Marshall on March 24th. According to Emma's later testimony, Monique began a conversation saying, "I need to tell you something about your dad," but was interrupted by a call from Marshall himself, who requested Emma put the call on speaker. That wasn't coincidence, Dr. Montgomery explains. Marshall was monitoring Monique's movements and interactions. The timing suggests he was either surveilling them or had some form of monitoring on Monique's regular phone. Monique's final and most desperate attempt came on March 26th, the day before her murder, when she wrote a letter to her mother explaining the situation. This letter, found in her desk drawer after her death, was never delivered. It began, "Mom, I'm in trouble and I'm scared. Something has been happening with Sheriff Marshall that started as mentoring but turned into something else." She was trying to break free from his control, Sarah Johnson notes solemnly. She just ran out of time. The events of March 27th, the day Monique Ellis was murdered, have been reconstructed through cell phone records, surveillance footage, witness statements, and physical evidence recovered during the investigation. Monique attended school that morning, though several teachers noted she appeared distressed and unusually quiet. Security footage shows her checking her phone repeatedly during classes, and text records from the secret phone reveal a series of increasingly urgent messages from Marshall. "We need to meet today. This can't wait. I have a solution for our situation." At 2:17 p.m., school records show Monique was signed out early by Sheriff Marshall, who cited a family emergency requiring her immediate attention. The school administrator who processed this early dismissal later testified that while unusual, she didn't question the county sheriff's authority to remove a student. This was Marshall's position, giving him access one final time, explains Detective Johnson. No other adult could have removed Monique from school without parental permission, but his badge literally opened doors. Surveillance cameras captured Marshall's department SUV leaving the school parking lot with Monique in the passenger seat. According to cell tower data, both Marshall's official phone and the secret phone he had given Monique traveled north out of town toward the county's rural forest preserve. The last text from Monique's secret phone was sent to her friend Emma at 3:04 p.m. "Tell my mom I love her if anything happens." Emma, not understanding the significance of this message, responded with confusion but received no reply. Marshall's department vehicle was recorded on a game camera entering a remote fire access road in the forest preserve at 3:22 p.m. No footage exists of the vehicle leaving. As Marshall later admitted, he disabled the camera when exiting the area. The premeditation is clear in these movements, notes prosecutor Rebecca Chen. Marshall chose a remote location within his jurisdiction, used his authority to access Monique, and took steps to conceal his presence. This wasn't a crime of passion, It was a calculated elimination of what he perceived as a threat. The medical examiner determined Monique Ellis died between 3:30 and 4:30 p.m. on March 27th from manual strangulation. Physical evidence indicated she had attempted to defend herself. Skin samples under her fingernails were later matched to Marshall, and defensive bruising on her arms showed she had fought for her life. The physical evidence tells us Monique did not go quietly, explains forensic pathologist Dr. Sarah Williams. The pattern of bruising and tissue damage suggests she struggled vigorously, which is consistent with a victim who had begun to break free from psychological control and recognize the danger she was in. After the murder, Marshall's movements demonstrate a calculated approach to evidence concealment. His department vehicle's GPS system, which he didn't have authority to disable, shows the SUV remained stationary at the Forest Preserve location for approximately 47 minutes before traveling to a secluded area near the county reservoir. Cell tower data indicates Marshall made a 12-minute call to the same burner phone he had contacted after learning of Monique's pregnancy. The recipient of these calls, former Deputy James Harker, later testified that Marshall had requested his help with a sensitive situation involving evidence that needed to disappear. Harker's testimony was crucial, notes Detective Johnson. It established that Marshall was thinking clearly enough to call for assistance and was focused on evidence concealment rather than remorse or panic. Between 5:30 and 7:15 p.m., Marshall's vehicle traveled to 3 different locations around the county: a dumpster behind an abandoned gas station, a construction site with a recently poured concrete foundation, and finally, the reservoir. Investigators later recovered Monique's backpack and jacket from the construction site, where they had been hastily buried in loose soil. At 7:23 p.m., Marshall returned to the sheriff's department, where security footage shows him entering with a duffel bag and proceeding to the evidence processing room, an area where he had unrestricted access and could work without supervision. He was using department resources to clean up evidence, explains Prosecutor Chen. The same facilities meant to process crime scenes were being used to help him conceal one. It's a particularly disturbing abuse of his position. When Diana Ellis reported her daughter missing at 9:42 p.m. that evening, Marshall's systematic manipulation of the investigation began. A process that showcased how thoroughly a person in authority could compromise the very systems designed to deliver justice. Marshall didn't just commit murder, he orchestrated a cover-up using the full resources of his department, explains Detective Johnson. He exploited every procedural advantage his position afforded him. As sheriff, Marshall had the authority to determine how the missing person report would be handled. Rather than recusing himself due to his connection to Monique through the Explorer program, he personally took charge of the case, assigning deputies who reported directly to him and establishing the investigative parameters. The first 48 hours of a missing person investigation are critical, notes FBI consultant Special Agent Marcus Rivera. By controlling those initial hours, Marshall could direct attention away from himself, establish false leads, and contaminate potential evidence. Marshall's first tactical decision was classifying Monique as a voluntary missing person, rather than an endangered juvenile. This classification reduced the urgency of the response and limited the resources allocated to the search. He justified this decision by claiming Monique had recently been troubled and had expressed interest in taking some time away to clear her head. Next, Marshall created a false timeline by telling investigators he had last seen Monique 2 days earlier at an Explorer program meeting. He strategically assigned deputies to canvass areas far from where her body was hidden and focused the investigation on a boyfriend Marshall claimed Monique had mentioned. Perhaps most disturbing was his manipulation of physical evidence. As sheriff, Marshall had unrestricted access to the evidence room, allowing him to contaminate, remove, or alter potential evidence before it could be properly processed. He even inserted himself into the collection of DNA samples from Monique's bedroom, explains Detective Johnson. We later discovered he had substituted evidence bags and deliberately mishandled items that might have contained his DNA. He wasn't just obstructing justice, he was weaponizing the justice system to protect himself. The transition from missing person case to homicide investigation occurred despite Marshall's efforts, largely due to a combination of his own mistakes, dedicated officers working within his department, and Diana Ellis's relentless advocacy for her daughter. The first crack in Marshall's cover-up appeared on day 3 when Deputy Sarah Collins noticed discrepancies in the sheriff's account of his movements on March 27th. The department vehicle's GPS data didn't match Marshall's claimed whereabouts during the afternoon. Monique disappeared. When Collins discreetly brought this to Marshall's attention, his explanation was dismissive and contradictory. Something felt wrong, Collins later testified. He said he'd been at a county commissioner's meeting, then changed his story to say he was following up on a case. When I mentioned the GPS showed his vehicle at the forest preserve, he became agitated and ordered me to focus on other aspects of the investigation. Collins took her concerns to State Police Lieutenant Michael Rodriguez, who had offered assistance with the missing person case. This crucial decision to step outside the chain of command, to go around Marshall rather than through him, would ultimately lead to the case being solved. Simultaneously, Diana Ellis was conducting her own investigation. After finding the undelivered letter in Monique's desk drawer, she brought this evidence directly to the district attorney rather than the sheriff's department. The letter's contents, which detailed Marshall's inappropriate relationship with Monique, provided probable cause for search warrants not subject to Marshall's control. The case broke open on April 2nd when a state police evidence team, executing a warrant Marshall couldn't block, discovered blood matching Monique's DNA in the cargo area of his department vehicle. Confronted with this evidence and the GPS data showing his movements, Marshall attempted to flee, but was apprehended by state troopers at a bus station 50 miles from Millfield. Monique's body was recovered the following day from a shallow grave in the forest preserve, approximately 400 yards from where Marshall's vehicle had been parked on the afternoon of March 27th. Despite all his knowledge of police procedures and his position of authority, notes Prosecutor Chen, Marshall couldn't anticipate that the very systems he commanded would ultimately expose him. No amount of power can completely conceal the truth when dedicated professionals refuse to be deterred. The investigation's pivot toward Sheriff Marshall began not with a single dramatic revelation, but with a series of small inconsistencies that gradually coalesced into suspicion. In cases where authority figures are involved, the path to justice often begins with someone noticing details that don't align, explains FBI behavioral analyst Dr. Rivera. It's rarely a smoking gun. It's the accumulation of discrepancies that someone brave enough decides to question. The first significant inconsistency emerged when Deputy Sarah Collins cross-referenced department vehicle logs with Marshall's stated whereabouts. While Marshall claimed to have been at administrative meetings during the afternoon of March 27th, the GPS data from his vehicle showed it had been stationary at the forest preserve for nearly an hour. That GPS data was our first real break, notes Detective Johnson. Department policy required all vehicle movements to be logged, and Marshall either forgot about this system or assumed no one would check it against his statements. Simultaneously, School Resource Officer Deputy James Wilson noted another discrepancy. The school sign-out sheet showed Marshall had removed Monique from school, citing a family emergency. Yet in his official statements, he claimed he hadn't seen Monique that day. These weren't just minor inconsistencies, explains Prosecutor Chen. They were fundamental contradictions that couldn't be explained away as memory lapses or misunderstandings. Perhaps most telling was Marshall's behavior during the early investigation. Multiple deputies noted his unusual interest in certain aspects of the case while showing surprising disinterest in others. He personally handled Monique's cell phone records, but showed little concern when search teams found no results in areas he had prioritized. His selective attention was a red flag, Deputy Collins later testified. He was intensely focused on her communications and who she might have talked to, but dismissed potentially important physical evidence. It felt like he was steering us away from certain avenues of investigation. These early inconsistencies didn't immediately implicate Marshall and Monique's disappearance, but they created enough concern that several deputies began quietly documenting their observations. Documentation that would later become crucial evidence. The investigation's trajectory changed dramatically on March 30th, when 3 key pieces of evidence emerged almost simultaneously, shifting suspicion firmly toward Marshall. The first breakthrough came when Diana Ellis discovered the undelivered letter in Monique's desk drawer. The 5-page handwritten document detailed Marshall's gradual grooming, the evolution of their relationship from mentorship to exploitation, and her fear about the pregnancy. Most critically, it named Marshall explicitly and expressed Monique's fear that he might do something desperate. That letter was the first direct evidence linking Marshall to Monique in a way that went beyond professional mentorship, explains Prosecutor Chen. It provided context for everything else we were discovering. The second crucial evidence emerged when digital forensic specialist Agent Lisa Kaminsky recovered deleted text messages from Monique's regular phone. While Marshall had been careful to use the secret phone for most communications, he had occasionally messaged her regular number. These texts, while not explicitly incriminating, showed a pattern of control and manipulation consistent with grooming. The language in those texts was textbook predatory communication, notes Dr. Montgomery. Phrases like, "This stays between us and no one else would understand what we have," are classic isolation tactics used by authority figures who abuse their position. The third and perhaps most damning evidence came from an unexpected source, Emma Marshall. When interviewed by State Police Lieutenant Rodriguez, Emma revealed the secret phone her father had given Monique. More importantly, she disclosed Monique's final text. "Tell my mom I love her if anything happens." Emma's statement was the tipping point, Detective Johnson explains. It established premeditation on Marshall's part with the secret phone, showed his efforts to create private communication channels, and most importantly, revealed Monique's fear and anticipation of harm on the very day she disappeared. With these 3 elements, the letter establishing the inappropriate relationship, the text messages showing manipulation, and Emma's revelation about the secret phone, investigators now had sufficient cause to formally shift their focus to Marshall as a suspect rather than an investigator. Investigating a sheriff presented unique challenges that required investigators to navigate departmental loyalty, jurisdictional complications, and the power dynamics inherent when targeting the highest law enforcement official in the county. The blue wall of silence isn't just a cliché, it's a real psychological and cultural barrier that can impede investigations of law enforcement, explains police psychologist Dr. James Wilson. Officers are trained to trust their chain of command and to present a unified front to the public. Suspecting your own sheriff violates those deeply ingrained principles. The breakthrough in overcoming these barriers came when Deputy Collins made the crucial decision to take her concerns outside the department. Rather than reporting her suspicions up the chain of command, which would have meant reporting to Marshall himself, she contacted State Police Lieutenant Rodriguez directly. That single decision changed everything, notes Detective Johnson. It created an investigative channel Marshall couldn't monitor or control. Rodriguez, recognizing the sensitivity of the situation, implemented a compartmentalized investigation structure. He formed a small task force of state officers with no connections to Millfield and secured authorization to investigate without notifying the sheriff's department. "We essentially created a parallel investigation," Rodriguez explained. "We needed to verify the evidence before confronting the department with allegations against their leader. Premature disclosure would have risked evidence tampering and witness intimidation. This parallel investigation yielded critical forensic evidence. When state police criminalists examined Marshall's department vehicle, secured via a sealed warrant Marshall wasn't aware of, they discovered blood traces in the cargo area that matched Monique's DNA profile. The final barrier fell when 3 deputies, led by Collins, collectively approached the district attorney with their documented concerns about Marshall's behavior during the investigation. This group action overcame the isolation that often prevents individual officers from speaking out. What ultimately broke the blue wall wasn't an outside force, Dr. Wilson observes. It was officers within the department choosing their oath to justice over loyalty to an individual. That's the true meaning of police integrity. By April 2nd, 5 days after Monique's disappearance, the fragmented evidence had coalesced into a compelling case against Marshall. The final pieces fell into place through a combination of forensic science, witness testimony, and Marshall's own mistakes. The most damning physical evidence came from Marshall's home, where a state police search team discovered Monique's blood on a pair of boots hidden in his garage. Forensic analysis revealed soil patterns on these boots matching the distinct mineral composition of the forest preserve area. "Physical evidence doesn't lie," explains forensic scientist Dr. Williams. While Marshall had been careful about most aspects of his cover-up, he overlooked these boots, perhaps believing his home would never be searched given his position. Simultaneously, digital evidence continued to mount. Forensic analysis of the department's computer system revealed Marshall had accessed Monique's missing person file multiple times, making subtle alterations to timeline details and removing references to the Explorer program. The case against Marshall solidified when former Deputy James Harker, facing charges himself for evidence tampering, agreed to testify about Marshall's calls requesting help with making evidence disappear. Harker's testimony provided direct evidence of consciousness of guilt and premeditation. On April 3rd, with Monique's body recovered and evidence securing the chain of events, Clayton Marshall was formally charged with first-degree murder, sexual assault of a minor, and obstruction of justice. The case that began as a missing person report had revealed a predator hiding behind a badge. This case demonstrates how predators in positions of authority can manipulate systems meant to protect the vulnerable, but also how dedicated professionals can overcome these barriers to deliver justice. If you found this analysis valuable, please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. In our next video, we'll examine the trial and the systemic changes implemented in Millfield following this case to prevent similar abuses of power. Your support allows us to continue examining these cases with the depth and sensitivity they deserve, focusing on prevention and education rather than sensationalism. The trial of Clayton Marshall began 11 months after Monique's murder, following extensive pretrial motions and a change of venue to ensure an impartial jury. The proceedings, which lasted 3 weeks, revealed the full extent of Marshall's crimes and manipulation. Prosecutor Rebecca Chen opened with a powerful statement. "This case is about the ultimate betrayal of trust. A man who swore to protect his community but instead preyed upon its most vulnerable members." The prosecution presented a methodical case, establishing the timeline of grooming, the pregnancy as motive, and the calculated nature of both the murder and cover-up. Digital forensics experts testified about the secret phone communications, while medical examiners detailed the defensive wounds, indicating Monique had fought for her life. Perhaps the most powerful testimony came from Emma Marshall, who took the stand against her father. In emotional testimony, she recounted Monique's final text message and her growing realization of her father's inappropriate interest in her friend. "I thought he was being helpful," Emma testified. "I never imagined he was. I never thought he could." Unable to complete her sentence, her testimony crystallized for the jury the profound betrayal Marshall had perpetrated not only against Monique, but against his own family. Marshall's defense attempted to portray Monique as troubled and unreliable, suggesting she had fabricated the relationship to gain attention. This strategy backfired dramatically when the prosecution presented the undelivered letter to her mother, written in Monique's hand, detailing her fear and confusion. After just 7 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict: guilty on all counts. The conviction of Sheriff Clayton Marshall sent shockwaves through Millfield, forcing the community to confront uncomfortable truths about trust, authority, and collective responsibility. "This wasn't just the failure of one man," explained sociologist Dr. Brennan. "It was a systemic failure that required community reflection. How had they created an environment where Marshall's behavior went unchallenged for so long?" In the immediate aftermath of the verdict, the community's reaction was polarized. Some residents, particularly those with close ties to law enforcement, initially expressed disbelief or sought to minimize Marshall's actions. Others, especially parents of teenagers who had participated in Marshall's programs, experienced profound guilt and anger. "I sent my daughter to his youth academy for 3 summers," one parent told reporters outside the courthouse. "I handed my child to a predator and thanked him for his service. How do I live with that?" The case prompted difficult conversations throughout Millfield about power dynamics, warning signs, and the danger of placing individuals above scrutiny. Local churches and community organizations held forums to discuss how to better protect vulnerable youth, while the school system implemented new training on recognizing grooming behaviors. Perhaps most significantly, the case shattered the community's sense of exceptionalism, the belief that things like that don't happen here. As one local pastor noted in a widely shared sermon, "We must acknowledge that evil doesn't announce itself. It hides behind respected faces and trusted positions. Our community's safety depends not on blind trust, but on appropriate vigilance." This painful reckoning ultimately led to meaningful reforms in how Millfield approached authority figures and youth protection. The devastation wrought by Clayton Marshall extended beyond his victim to include his own family, who were forced to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the predator revealed during the trial. Susan Marshall filed for divorce immediately following her husband's arrest. Court records indicate she had no knowledge of his crimes, though testimony revealed a household dominated by Marshall's controlling behavior. In a brief statement after the verdict, she expressed profound sorrow for Monique Ellis and her mother, and asked for privacy as she and her children attempt to rebuild our lives from this betrayal. The most visible impact fell on Emma Marshall, who not only lost her father to prison, but also carried the weight of her unwitting role in facilitating his access to Monique. Following her courageous testimony at trial, Emma deferred her college acceptance and sought therapy to process her trauma. Emma experiences what we call secondary victimization, explains Dr. Patel. She's dealing with betrayal trauma from her father's actions while simultaneously processing guilt about her friendship with Monique. Though she bears no responsibility for her father's crimes, that rational understanding doesn't easily translate to emotional healing. 2 years after the trial, Emma established a small foundation dedicated to educating young people about recognizing grooming behaviors and authority abuse. In her first public speaking engagement, she addressed a youth conference with remarkable candor. "I couldn't see what was happening because I had no framework to recognize it. My goal is to give others the awareness I lacked." The Marshall family's journey illustrates how the ripple effects of predatory behavior extend far beyond the primary victim, creating complex trauma that requires years of healing. On June 17th, following impact statements from Diana Ellis and Emma Marshall, Judge Carolyn Rodriguez sentenced Clayton Marshall to life imprisonment without possibility of parole for first-degree murder, plus consecutive sentences totaling 30 years for sexual assault of a minor and obstruction of justice. In delivering the sentence, Judge Rodriguez addressed Marshall directly. "You weaponized the trust of your community, your position of authority, and the innocence of a young woman who believed in you." This sentence reflects not just the taking of Monique Ellis's life, but the calculated betrayal that preceded it. Marshall currently serves his sentence at a maximum security state correctional facility, where he is held in protective custody due to his law enforcement background. He has maintained his innocence despite overwhelming evidence, filing multiple appeals that have been systematically rejected by higher courts. The Sheriff's Department underwent comprehensive restructuring following Marshall's conviction. New oversight protocols were implemented, including mandatory reporting of all one-on-one interactions between officers and minors, independent review of youth programs, and anonymous reporting systems for concerning behavior. Diana Ellis established a scholarship in her daughter's name for students pursuing environmental science, the future Monique had dreamed of before her life was cut short. The annual Monique Ellis Memorial Scholarship provides full tuition for a graduating senior from Millfield High School. "Nothing can bring Monique back," Diana stated at the scholarship's inaugural ceremony. "But perhaps her story can protect others and create opportunities she never had the chance to pursue." Marshall's case is now studied in law enforcement training programs nationwide as a cautionary example of how authority can be abused and the importance of accountability at every level of the justice system. The Marshall case provides a comprehensive framework for identifying grooming behaviors before they escalate to abuse. These warning signs are particularly important to recognize when exhibited by authority figures. Grooming red flags: excessive interest and special attention. Singling out a specific child/teen for special opportunities not offered to others, offering privileges, gifts, or access that seem disproportionate to the relationship. Creating reasons for one-on-one time that exclude other adults or peers. Boundary testing and violations. Gradual introduction of physical contact that becomes increasingly intimate. Discussions about sexual or inappropriate topics, disguised as education or mentorship. Requesting secrecy about aspects of the relationship. "This is just between us." Communication outside official channels or at unusual hours. Isolation tactics. Creating distance between the victim and their protective relationships. Criticizing the victim's parents, friends, or other mentors. Scheduling activities that conflict with the victim's other relationships. Positioning themselves as the only person who truly understands the victim. Control and dependency creation. Making the victim feel indebted through favors, opportunities, or gifts. Alternating between praise and criticism to create emotional instability. Linking the victim's future success directly to the relationship. Creating special rules or exceptions that apply only to their relationship. Trust manipulation. Using their position to establish credibility with parents and the community. Creating legitimate-seeming context for inappropriate access. Leveraging institutional authority to discourage questioning of their behavior. Gradually normalizing inappropriate interactions by starting with acceptable behavior. The most dangerous aspect of grooming is its incremental nature, explains Dr. Rivera. Each boundary crossed makes the next violation seem smaller by comparison. By the time obviously inappropriate behavior occurs, the victim's normal alarm systems have been systematically disabled. Parents, educators, and community members should be particularly alert when an authority figure seems overly interested in a specific child, creates special opportunities available only through them, or establishes private communication channels outside normal oversight. Trust your instincts, advises child protection specialist Sarah Johnson. If an interaction between an adult and child makes you uncomfortable, there's often a good reason for that discomfort. Predators count on our reluctance to question authority figures or appear paranoid. Preventing authority-based abuse requires both individual vigilance and institutional safeguards. The Marshall case highlights specific systemic vulnerabilities that can be addressed through policy and practice changes. Institutional prevention strategies, transparency requirements, mandatory documentation of one-on-one meetings between authority figures and minors, clear purpose and time-bound areas for all IOUth mentorship activities, open-door policies for meetings with young people, regular program audits by independent reviewers, oversight mechanisms, multiple adults present during youth activities, random observation of youth programs, clear reporting structures that don't route concerns back to the potential abuser, regular background checks and continued vetting of those working with youth communication protocols, restrictions on private electronic communications between adults and youth, transparent group messaging that includes parents or program supervisors, clear guidelines about appropriate topics and boundaries, regular review of communication patterns, reporting systems, anonymous reporting options for concerning behavior, protection for whistleblowers who report potential misconduct, clear escalation paths that bypass the chain of command when necessary, regular training on mandatory reporting requirement, and for those concerned about potential grooming, contact appropriate protective services for guidance without necessarily filing a formal report. Speak with school counselors or mental health professionals about your observations. Document concerning patterns of behavior with specific dates and details. Trust your instincts. It's better to raise a concern that proves unfounded than to ignore warning signs. For victims, remember that abuse is never the victim's fault, regardless of how the relationship developed. Seek support from trusted adults outside the influence of the abuser. Preserve evidence of inappropriate communications when possible. Know that healing is possible with proper support and resources. The most important thing to understand about authority-based abuse is that it thrives in isolation and secrecy. Concludes the Dr. Montgomery. Creating systems of transparency, oversight, and accessible reporting is our best defense against predators who would abuse their positions of trust. The Marshall case provides a sobering study in how power, when unchecked, can corrupt even those entrusted with protecting the most vulnerable. What makes this case particularly instructive is that Clayton Marshall didn't begin his career with predatory intent, explains Dr. Wilson. His descent from respected public servant to predator and murderer illustrates how power itself can become a corrupting force when combined with lack of oversight and community deference. Marshall's 2-decade career shows a gradual expansion of authority, accompanied by diminishing accountability. As his status in the community grew, the mechanisms that might have checked his behavior, questioning, oversight, transparency, simultaneously weakened. This is the paradox of power, notes sociologist Dr. Brennan. The more authority someone accumulates, the less likely others are to question their actions. Yet this is precisely when scrutiny becomes most essential. The progression from minor boundary violations to exploitation to murder didn't occur overnight. Each unchallenged overreach normalized the next, creating a continuum of misconduct that escalated over years. Marshall's case demonstrates what psychologists call the slippery slope of moral degradation, explains Dr. Montgomery. Each ethical violation that goes unchallenged makes the next violation easier to justify. Without external checks, internal moral constraints gradually erode. This pattern extends beyond individual psychology to institutional cultures. When organizations prioritize reputation over accountability, when communities place certain figures above questioning, they inadvertently create environments where abuse can flourish. The lesson isn't that power inevitably corrupts, Dr. Brennan concludes, but rather that power without accountability almost certainly will. Marshall's position didn't make abuse inevitable. The community's unwillingness to question that position did. Though Monique Ellis's life was tragically cut short, Her story has created ripples of change that continue to protect others and challenge systems that enable abuse. In Millfield, the most immediate impact came through comprehensive reforms of youth protection policies. The Monique Ellis Youth Safety Act, passed by the County Commission 6 months after Marshall's conviction, established mandatory reporting structures, independent oversight of all youth programs, and anonymous reporting systems that bypass chain-of-command concerns. These aren't just procedural changes, explains child advocate Sarah Johnson. They represent a fundamental shift in how the community approaches authority and protection. Monique's case forced Millfield to recognize that safety requires vigilance, not deference. Beyond local reforms, Monique's story has become a powerful teaching ability in law enforcement training nationwide. Case studies based on Marshall's grooming tactics and abuse of authority are now incorporated into ethics training at police academies in 17 states. Perhaps the most personal aspect of Monique's legacy comes through the scholarship established in her name. The Monique Ellis Memorial Scholarship has already helped 7 students pursue environmental science degrees, the future Monique herself had dreamed of. Each scholarship recipient carries forward a dream that was taken from Monique, Diana Ellis explained at the most recent award ceremony. They're not just pursuing education, they're extending a life that was cut short. The foundation established by Emma Marshall complements this legacy by focusing specifically on education about grooming and authority abuse. Its programs have reached over 15,000 teenagers with age-appropriate information about recognizing manipulation tactics. Monique's story saves others, Emma stated simply. That's a legacy that gives meaning to an otherwise senseless tragedy. The Marshall case illuminates broader societal questions about how we structure authority, accountability, and protection of the vulnerable. This case isn't just about one predatory sheriff, explains Dr. Brennan. It's about the systems that enable predators in positions of authority, systems we all participate in creating and maintaining. The first systemic issue involves how communities often conflate authority with trustworthiness. Marshall's position didn't just give him access to victims, it created a presumption of virtue that discouraged questioning. This dynamic exists across institutions, from law enforcement to education to religious organizations. We need to separate respect for positions from blind trust in individuals, notes Dr. Rivera. Healthy communities respect authority while maintaining appropriate skepticism and oversight. The second issue concerns reporting structures that route concerns back through the very individuals being reported. When Deputy Collins first noticed discrepancies in Marshall's statements, department policy required her to report these concerns up the chain of command, directly to Marshall himself. Effective protection requires reporting pathways that bypass potential abusers, explains Detective Johnson. This applies in every hierarchical organization, not just law enforcement. Perhaps most fundamentally, the case challenges how we balance institutional reputation against individual protection. Throughout the investigation, multiple witnesses admitted they had noticed concerning behaviors, but hesitated to speak up for fear of damaging the department's standing in the community. This prioritization of institutional reputation over individual safety creates the perfect environment for abuse, Dr. Montgomery observes. Until we collectively decide that protecting vulnerable individuals matters more than protecting powerful institutions, these patterns will continue. The Marshall case thus offers not just a study in individual predatory behavior, but a mirror reflecting broader societal choices about power, accountability, and what we truly value. As we conclude our examination of this tragic case, we're left with a profound question that extends beyond Monique Ellis and Clayton Marshall. How do we create communities where authority serves protection rather than enabling exploitation? The answer lies not in abandoning trust, but in redefining it, recognizing that true trustworthiness welcomes accountability rather than avoiding it. The most reliable authority figures are precisely those who establish transparent boundaries, encourage oversight, and create systems that don't depend solely on their personal integrity. The healthiest communities, notes Dr. Brennan, are those where questioning authority isn't seen as disrespectful, but as an essential component of collective safety. I hope this analysis has provided insights that go beyond the sensational aspects of this case to the deeper patterns that allow such tragedies to occur. If you found value in this examination, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. More importantly, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. What changes have you seen in your own communities regarding youth protection? What warning signs do you now recognize that you might have missed before? Your experiences and insights might help others recognize concerning patterns before they escalate. Please share this video with those who work with young people or who are responsible for creating institutional policies. The more widely these patterns are recognized, the safer our communities become. The tragedy of Monique Ellis reminds us that our collective safety depends not just on the character of those in authority, but on the courage of communities willing to question, systems designed for accountability, and the recognition that protection requires vigilance rather than blind trust.